The roads of first-century Jerusalem were not clean. To walk through the crowded streets during the week of Passover meant walking through dust, mud, and the refuse of thousands of animals and travelers. By the time you arrived at your destination, your feet were covered in the thick grime of the city. Because of this, there was a strict cultural rule for any formal meal. Before you could recline at the table, your feet had to be washed. This was not just about hygiene, it was about honor. To eat a sacred meal with unwashed feet was a deep violation of hospitality and respect. In John chapter 13, Jesus and his disciples are gathered in a private upper room. The preparations for the Passover meal have been made. The table is set. In the corner of the room, the tools for foot washing are waiting. There is a basin. There is a pitcher of water. There is a linen towel. Everything is ready. But there is one glaring problem. There is no servant in the room. In the ancient world, washing the dirt off someone else's feet was not a job for just anyone. It was reserved for the absolute lowest slave in the household. It was considered so demeaning that Jewish tradition often exempted Hebrew servants from having to do it. It was the work of the bottom tier of society. But Jesus and the 12 disciples are alone. There is no host, there is no servant, which means one of the 12 men in that room has to do it. And this is where we have to look at another gospel to understand the heavy, awkward silence filling the upper room. Luke chapter 22 tells us exactly what the disciples were doing right before this dinner began. They were not praying. They were not preparing their hearts for the sacred festival. They were arguing. And the subject of their argument is highly specific. They were debating which one of them was the greatest. They were positioning themselves for power in the kingdom they believed Jesus was about to establish. Now, put these two details together. 12 men are actively arguing about who is the most important, the most powerful, and the most worthy of honor. And right in the middle of their argument, they walk into a room where a basin and a towel are sitting in the corner. The tension in the room must have been thick enough to cut. Every single one of them knows what needs to happen. Every single one of them sees the basin. But if one of them breaks from the group, walks over to the corner, and picks up the towel, the argument is instantly over. The man who washes the feet becomes the lowest. He takes the position of the bottom-tier slave. So, they do the unthinkable. They do nothing. They ignore the basin. They ignore the towel. They walk right past the water, and they recline at the table with the filth of the streets still on their feet. It is a standoff of pure human pride. No one is willing to lower himself for the sake of the others. The disciples are silently waiting to see who will break first. They assume someone will eventually have to do the job of the lowest servant. But as the meal begins, someone finally moves. Someone stands up from the table, and it is the very last person they expect. The Gospel of John slows down the narrative almost to a freeze frame. John does not just tell us that Jesus washed their feet. He breaks the action down into a deliberate, step-by-step sequence. Verse 4 tells us exactly what happens. Jesus rises from supper. He lays aside his outer garments. He takes a towel, and he ties it around his waist. On the surface, this is simply what you have to do to wash feet. You cannot kneel on the dirt floor and do the heavy work of a slave while wearing the long, flowing outer robes of a respected rabbi. The robes had to be removed, but John is doing something deeper here. The language he uses to describe this physical movement is not an accident. When Jesus stands up and takes off his outer clothing, John is showing us a living, breathing picture of the incarnation. To understand this, we have to look closely at the words John chooses. The phrase translated as laying aside, his garment centers on the Greek word tithemi. It means to lay down, to set aside, or to yield. This is the exact same word Jesus uses earlier in the Gospel of John, in chapter 10, when he says, "I lay down my life for the sheep." He lays down his garments. He lays down his life. It is the same verb, the same deliberate action. The physical stripping off of his outer robe is a foreshadowing of the cross, but it also points backward. It points to the cosmic movement of the Son of God before he ever walked the earth. In the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, the Apostle Paul describes how Christ came into the world. Paul writes that Jesus, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Instead, he emptied himself. He took on the form of a servant. In the upper room, Jesus is physically acting out the theology of Philippians chapter 2. He is the Lord of the table. He is the master of the room. He holds the highest seat of honor. But he voluntarily rises. He takes off the outer garment that represents his status, his teaching authority, and his public dignity. He strips himself of his visible glory, and he stands before them in the simple tunic of a common laborer. He left the glory of heaven to enter the dirt of human history. Now, he leaves the head of the table to enter the dirt of the upper room. The disciples are sitting in stunned silence. The man who calmed the sea, the man who raised Lazarus from the dead, the man they just proclaimed as the coming king, is standing before them without his mantle. He has emptied himself of his rank. This was completely contrary to everything the ancient world believed about power. In the Roman Empire, power was measured by how many people served you. Greatness was measured by your distance from the dirt. The higher you rose, the cleaner your hands remained. You wore layers of fine clothing, specifically to separate yourself from the lower classes. But the God of the Bible is moving in the exact opposite direction. Jesus is systematically dismantling the disciples' entire argument about greatness. They had been arguing over who gets to sit on the highest throne. Jesus is showing them that true divine power is willing to walk to the lowest place in the room. He has laid aside his garments. He has lowered himself. It is a beautiful picture of Jesus leaving heaven to come to earth. But the theological picture goes even deeper the moment he picks up the towel. Jesus is standing in the center of the room. He holds a linen towel. He reaches for the pitcher and pours water into the basin. In the quiet of the upper room, the sound of the splashing water must have been deafening. He walks over to the first disciple. He kneels down on the dirt floor and he begins to wash. To fully grasp the scandal of this moment, we have to remember how the Gospel of John begins. John chapter 1 opens with a cosmic vision of who Jesus is. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made." This is the foundational truth of John's Gospel. Jesus is not just a teacher. He is the eternal creator. Now, hold that truth and look at the scene in chapter 13. The creator of the universe is on his knees. The hands that formed the oceans are pouring water into a clay bowl. The hands that formed the human body are now scrubbing the filth of the Jerusalem streets off the heels of fishermen, tax collectors, and zealots. The Word became flesh, and the flesh is holding a dirty towel. In the ancient social order, this was not just surprising, it was offensive. Society in the first century was built on a rigid hierarchy. Everyone knew their place. Everyone knew who was above them and who was below them. At the very bottom of that ladder was the foot washer. The job was considered so degrading that ancient texts show it was often forced upon the lowest-ranking Gentile slaves. A Jewish servant could sometimes be exempt from this specific duty because it was seen as a stripping away of human dignity. To touch someone else's dirty feet was to declare yourself entirely subordinate to them. It was a physical demonstration of inferiority. Yet John chapter 13, verse 5, is painfully clear. It says, "Jesus poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him." He does not just symbolically sprinkle them. He does the actual, messy, humiliating work. He moves from one man to the next. Imagine the silence in the room. Just moments earlier, they had been arguing about who among them was the greatest. They were debating who deserved the highest seats of honor. Now, the man they call Lord is performing the task they all refuse to do. Every time Jesus moves to the next disciple, their argument about human greatness is dismantled piece by piece. He is washing the feet of James and John, the brothers who recently asked to sit at his right and left hand in glory. He is washing the feet of Matthew, the former tax collector. He is even washing the feet of Judas Iscariot. Jesus knows exactly what Judas is about to do. He knows the betrayal has already been set in motion. Yet he kneels before Judas, takes his feet, and washes them anyway. The love of God does not stop at the edge of betrayal. This is what the incarnation actually looks like. God did not come to earth to be served. He came to serve. He did not come to demand honor from humanity. He came to lower himself into the dirt of the human condition. Jesus is moving around the circle. The disciples are paralyzed by shame and shock. They do not know what to say. They do not know how to stop him. But as Jesus moves across the room, he approaches Simon Peter. And Peter is not going to stay silent. For Peter, this is not just an awkward moment. It is a massive theological crisis. His entire understanding of how a Messiah should act is collapsing right in front of his eyes. The creator of the universe is on his knees, washing dirt off the feet of fishermen. And in this quiet room, one disciple suddenly refuses to let it happen. The room is quiet, except for the sound of splashing water. Jesus moves from one man to the next, until he kneels in front of Simon Peter. And Peter finally breaks the silence. In John chapter 13, verse 6, Peter looks down at Jesus and asks, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" It is a question loaded with disbelief. But to understand Peter's reaction, we have to look past the surface. It is easy to read this moment and think Peter is simply being stubborn or perhaps demonstrating false humility. We often treat this as just another example of Peter speaking before he thinks. But something much heavier is happening here. Peter is experiencing a massive theological crisis. His entire worldview is colliding with the basin. Just a short time before this dinner, Peter had made the ultimate declaration about who Jesus was. He had looked at Jesus and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." In the first century Jewish mind, the title of Christ, or Messiah, carried a very specific set of expectations. The Messiah was supposed to be a conquering king. He was the prophesied ruler who would overthrow the Roman occupation, restore the throne of David, and lead the nation into a golden age of triumph. The Messiah was meant to be served. He was meant to be exalted. He was meant to ascend to the highest seat of power. Peter's theology simply has no category for a Messiah with a towel around his waist. For Peter, divine power looks like victory, dominance, and unapproachable glory. It does not look like a basin of dirty water. So, when Jesus kneels down and reaches for Peter's feet, Peter's entire understanding of God is threatened. If Jesus is the eternal king, he cannot do the work of the lowest slave. The two ideas cannot coexist in Peter's mind. Jesus answers his initial question gently. In verse 7, Jesus says, "What I am doing, you do not understand now, but afterward, you will understand." Jesus is telling Peter to wait. He is saying, "Watch the whole pattern unfold. Let me finish the work I have started." But Peter cannot let it happen. He cannot bear to see his king humiliated. In verse 8, Peter draws a hard line. He says, "You shall never wash my feet." In the original Greek, Peter's phrasing is incredibly emphatic. It is a double negative combined with a reference to eternity. A more literal translation would be, "You will absolutely never wash my feet, forever." Peter thinks he is doing the right thing. He thinks he is defending the dignity of Jesus. He is trying to protect the glory of God. But Peter has fundamentally misunderstood what the glory of God actually looks like. He is trying to stop Jesus from doing the very thing Jesus came to the world to do. Peter wants a God who stays high above, clean and untainted by human mess. But God has chosen to step directly into the dirt. This is not a lesson on manners. It is a revelation of the heart of God. For Peter, greatness means ascending. For Jesus, greatness means descending. And because Peter does not yet understand the cross, he cannot possibly understand the basin. Jesus does not back down. He does not commend Peter for his reverence. Instead, Jesus gives an answer that shatters Peter's pride. Peter thinks he is protecting the dignity of Jesus. But Jesus gives an answer that changes the meaning of the entire meal. Peter has just drawn a line in the sand. He has looked at the God of the universe and said, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus looks back at him, still holding the towel, still kneeling on the floor. And his answer in John chapter 13, verse 8, completely shifts the weight of the moment. Jesus says, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Some English translations say, "You have no part with me." The original word used here implies inheritance. It means a shared portion, a deep relational bond, a guaranteed place in the family. Jesus is telling Peter something profound. This is no longer just about hospitality. This is no longer just a lesson in good manners or a demonstration of leadership. Jesus has just tied the water in the basin to salvation itself. He is saying, if you do not let me lower myself to cleanse you, you cannot belong to me. This is the ultimate offense to human pride. We instinctively want to be worthy. We want to clean ourselves up before we approach God. We want to enter the kingdom of heaven based on our own strength, our own righteousness, our own ability to follow the rules. But the gospel requires something entirely different. The gospel requires us to admit that we are covered in the dirt of a broken world and that we cannot wash it off ourselves. We have to sit in the chair, look at the creator of the universe on his knees, and let him serve us. We have to accept the charity of God. For Peter, this is terrifying. The moment Jesus says the words, "You have no share with me," Peter panics. If the basin is the only way to stay connected to Jesus, Peter wants all of it. In verse 9, Peter swings to the exact opposite extreme. He says, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." A moment ago, he wanted no washing. Now, he wants a full bath. Peter is still missing the point. He is still trying to dictate the terms of the relationship. He is still trying to tell Jesus how the cleansing should happen. But Jesus responds with a beautiful, clarifying truth. In verse 10, Jesus says, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean." Jesus is making a profound theological distinction using a simple cultural picture. In the ancient world, before you went to a formal banquet, you would bathe at the public bathhouse or in your own home. Your entire body was clean. But as you walked from the bathhouse to the banquet hall, your sandaled feet would pick up the dust of the road. When you arrived, you did not need another full bath. You only needed your feet washed. Jesus is using this everyday reality to explain how grace works. When you belong to Christ, when you have been bathed in his forgiveness, your identity is secure. You are fundamentally clean. That is your permanent standing before God. But as you walk through the brokenness of this world, you are going to pick up dust. You are going to fail. You will experience the daily grime of human life and temptation. You do not need to be saved all over again. You do not need a new bath. You just need to come back to the basin. You need the daily, relational forgiveness that keeps your fellowship with God restored. Jesus is offering Peter both. He is securing his eternal cleanness, and he is providing for his daily washing. The physical water in the bowl is pointing directly to the spiritual reality of the cross. Jesus finishes washing Peter. He finishes washing the rest of the disciples. He wipes their feet dry with the towel wrapped around his waist. He has made it clear that the basin is tied to salvation itself. But notice what Jesus does next, because the physical sequence of his actions is not an accident. The basin is empty. The linen towel is damp and stained with the dust of Jerusalem. The feet of the 12 disciples are clean, but the theological picture Jesus is painting is not quite finished. John chapter 13, verse 12, records the next physical movement in the room. It says, "When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, 'Do you understand what I have done to you?'" If we read this quickly, it just sounds like the practical end of a household chore. He finished the job, got dressed, and sat back down to eat. But remember the careful language John has been using to describe this event. Earlier, John told us that Jesus laid aside his garments. The Greek word was tithemi, to lay down. It is the exact word Jesus uses to describe laying down his life for his sheep. Now, John tells us Jesus put his garments back on. The original Greek word used here is lambano. It means to take, to receive, or to take back up. This pairing of words is not a coincidence. It is the completion of a profound biblical pattern. Listen to the specific phrasing Jesus uses in John chapter 10, verse 17. He says, "I lay down my life that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again." Lay down, tithemi, take up, lambano. In the quiet of the upper room, Jesus is physically acting out the entire span of his redemptive work before it even happens. He laid aside his garments, stepping into the dirt of humanity, pointing directly toward the humiliation of the cross. Now, he takes his garments back up. He reclaims his mantle. He wraps himself in the robes of his authority once again. This is a living picture of the resurrection. He is showing them that the grave will not hold him. The work of lowering himself into the dirt is finished. The suffering of the cross will be fully endured, but it will not be the final word. He will take his life back up. And then, John gives us one more detail. He says Jesus resumed his place. Literally, he reclined again at the table. He returns to the highest seat of honor. He takes his rightful place at the head of the feast. This is a picture of the ascension. It beautifully mirrors the end of the pattern in Philippians chapter 2. That passage tells us that because Christ emptied himself and became obedient to the point of death, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. The descent into the dirt is over. The ascent into glory has begun. Pause for a second and look at the movement we have witnessed. So far, this has not been a random set of details or a simple lecture on good manners. The physical sequence of actions has mapped perfectly onto the greatest theological truth in human history. Jesus leaves the head of the table. He strips himself of his visible glory. He takes the form of a servant. He cleanses his people in the dirt. He takes his glory back up, and he returns to his exalted seat. The entire gospel has just been preached in the silent movements of a single room.
The disciples are watching him sit back down. They are still processing the shock of the cold water. They are still feeling the sting of their own pride, remembering how they had fiercely argued over human greatness just an hour before. Now, Jesus is looking at them from the head of the table. He is no longer kneeling on the floor. He is seated in absolute authority. He looks at them and says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am." He has reclaimed his title. He has acted out his death, and now he has acted out his return to glory. And once he is seated, the silence in the room shifts. He is ready to speak. He is about to give them a command that will define the rest of their lives. It is a command that will change world history. Jesus is seated at the head of the table. The disciples are listening. The argument about who is the greatest is completely dead. No one is talking about thrones or power anymore. They are staring at the man who just scrubbed the dirt of the streets off their feet. And in this quiet, holy moment, Jesus gives them a directive. In John chapter 13, verse 34, he says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." At first glance, that might not sound new at all. The command to love was deeply embedded in the Hebrew scriptures. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, clearly said, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The disciples had known that verse since they were children. So why does Jesus call this a new commandment? The answer is in the second half of the verse. He says, "Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." That is the terrifying, beautiful new standard. Jesus is not just telling them to be kind to each other. He is not just telling them to treat others the way they want to be treated. He is pointing directly to the damp towel. He is pointing to the basin of dirty water sitting in the corner of the room. He is saying, "The way I just loved you, that is how you must love each other." In English, we use the word love to describe a feeling. We love a song. We love a place. We love our friends. We treat it as an emotion that happens to us. But the New Testament was written in Greek, and the word used here is agape. Agape is not primarily an emotion. It is an action of the will. It is the deliberate choice to seek the highest good of another person, even when it costs you your pride, your time, or your rights. Jesus just gave them a physical, undeniable definition of agape. It looks like stripping off your dignity. It looks like stepping away from your privilege. It looks like kneeling in the dirt to wash the feet of the people who are about to abandon you in your darkest hour. Remember who was in that room. Jesus washed the feet of Peter, the man who would deny him 3 times before the sun came up. He washed the feet of Thomas, who would soon doubt his resurrection. He washed the feet of James and John, who had tried to use his kingdom for their own political gain. He loved them at their worst, in their dirt, in their pride. And now, he turns to these 12 flawed men and says, "This is your standard, just as I have loved you." Then, Jesus takes it one step further. In verse 35, he makes a statement that should completely redefine how we view the church. He says, "By this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Notice what Jesus does not say. He does not say the world will know you are my disciples by your perfect theology. He does not say they will know you by the size of your buildings, or your political influence, or how well you win arguments. He says the defining mark of a Christian is the basin. The ultimate proof that you belong to Jesus is your willingness to take the towel, lower yourself, and serve the people around you. In the Roman Empire, this idea was entirely foreign. The ancient world did not value humility. Humility was considered a weakness. It was the posture of a slave. To the ancient mind, power meant domination. But Jesus is launching a completely different kind of kingdom. A kingdom where the leaders are the servants. A kingdom where power is exercised through sacrificial love. When the early church began to spread across the empire, they did not conquer by force. They conquered by outserving the world. They cared for the sick during plagues when everyone else fled. They lived out the agape love of the upper room. Jesus ties the ultimate proof of their faith to the physical act he just performed, which leaves us with a profound realization about what the church is actually supposed to look like and what it means to truly follow the King. When we read the story of the Last Supper, we usually rush past the basin. We treat it like the opening act before the real event begins. We see it as a quick lesson on good manners, a touching preamble before the breaking of the bread and the pouring of the wine. But John chapter 13 is not a footnote. It is the master key to understanding everything Jesus is about to do. For 3.5 years, the disciples had been waiting for a king to rise. They wanted a conqueror. They wanted someone to tear down the Roman architecture of power and replace it with their own. But Jesus did not come to swap one human hierarchy for another. He came to invert the entire system. Human power builds pyramids. It pushes the weak to the bottom to elevate the strong to the top. The higher you ascend, the fewer people you serve, and the more people serve you. That is how the ancient world worked. That is how our world still works. But the kingdom of God is an inverted pyramid. The King of Kings places himself at the very bottom. He bears the weight of the entire structure. He takes the dirt of the world onto his own hands. When Jesus picked up the towel, he was not taking a break from being God. He was showing them what God is actually like. He was revealing that true, divine power does not look like domination. It looks like self-giving love. The cross was only hours away. Later that night, the disciples would watch Jesus be stripped of his garments again. They would watch him be humiliated in front of the world. They would watch him bleed and die. And at first, they would think it was a massive defeat. But eventually, they would remember the upper room. They would remember the deliberate, careful way he laid aside his robes. They would realize that his life was not taken from him by the Romans. He laid it down of his own accord. When they looked back at the crucifixion, they would finally recognize the pattern. The cross was the ultimate basin. It was the moment the creator of the universe lowered himself into the deepest dirt of human brokenness to wash his people clean forever. He laid his life down into the dust of the earth, and 3 days later, he would take it back up. He would wrap himself in glory, and he would resume his place at the highest seat of honor. This changes everything about how we are called to live today. The church was never meant to be a place where we argue over who is the greatest. It was never meant to be a stage for human pride or a ladder for social climbing. It was meant to be a community of the basin. It is meant to be a gathering of people who know they have been washed by absolute grace and who are now entirely willing to kneel in the dirt for each other. If this journey through Scripture has helped you see the Last Supper with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so we can continue uncovering the deep patterns of the Bible together. The next time you read the story of the upper room, do not rush past the water. Stop and look at the king on the floor. The basin was never just a household chore. It was the quiet architecture of redemption,